Hey guys, welcome back to Mondays at the Museum. I'm Carrie and I'm here at the Anna Bemis Palmer Museum in York, Nebraska. So there are 13 weeks left of this display. Yes, I counted. Because I was trying to best figure out a way to show you as much of this display and collection as I could in that time that I have remaining. And I realized that there are 11 towns that are included in this display. And what a better way to incorporate as much of the display as I could by breaking it down by town. And so I would give you a brief history of the town and then show you the artifacts that we have currently on display representing that town. The display is laid out like a map of York County, roughly. And I'm just going to go in order of from where they are from my desk, which means Arborville is up first. So I'm going to give you a brief history of Arborville, and then I'm going to show you the artifacts that we have on hand from that town. And then next week would be Benedict, after that Bradshaw, after that Henderson, etc., etc., etc. So going into a brief history of Arborville. Arborville itself has kind of a brief history. To go all the way back to the beginnings, we're going to go back to the early 1870s when a guy named John Willard Kingston and his two very young sons moved to the area. So Kingston had a really hard life. He lost both his daughter and his wife to tuberculosis. He served in the Civil War. He and his sons moved to this area to kind of get the fresh start. He's listed as paying taxes in 1871. So he and his family built what they called a dugout, and it is exactly as it seems. So you're digging out a place to live and then covering it with the structure. So you're digging out the side of a hill or you're digging into the ground. And they said that they later built a house very close to where that original dugout site was. And because this is the first permanent structure in the area, it became very multifaceted. So it was not only his residence, but then it also became the post office, which they called Willard Station. And Mr. Kingston himself became postmaster. Interestingly enough, he was also justice of the peace and coroner at the time. And then in 1873, because again, only permanent structure, hey, let's use this as our first school district ever. So Kingston was never bored, ever. Eventually, he did remarry and have more kids. After Kingston came a guy named Philander Church, and then several families all at once because of a guy named C.S. Harrison. Now, you're going to hear a lot about Harrison when you talk about the history of Arborville, and it's basically because he's sort of responsible for the building of the town. So Harrison was a minister from New York State, and he basically helped 600 people relocate from Illinois to this area and help them find homes and build their living. Arborville was established in approximately 1874. It was platted out by Harrison and a bunch of volunteers, and it was laid out in 8 blocks. Each of the streets was named in honor of a tree, and this is because Harrison was not only a minister, but he was also a florist, and he is actually responsible for why York County has so many trees everywhere. He planted many trees in Arborville specifically to represent the town's name. He also started the Congregational Church, which was approximately 1876, and he was a minister there for several years. The church is actually still around today, although it has changed up religion since then and representation and everything like that, but we will get there in a minute. As for these other settlers, so a lot of backgrounds were represented. You had English, Irish, German, Dutch, French, etc., etc. And then you also got other trades and skills that came to town with them, which were teachers, musicians, carpenters, blacksmiths, farmers, stuff like that. A rather weird part of York County history, you wouldn't think about it today, but it was a pretty big deal back then, were grasshopper invasions, specifically in 1874 and 1876. Supposedly they were so bad that they wiped out all sustainable crops in the area. Like any plant life that they were living off of was just decimated. And the community had to continue to rebuild. So after 1874, after 1876, but the people were resilient. And in 1876, the first store in town was opened by a W.H. Fairchild. It did later burn down. Then there was a drugstore added in 1877, also burned down. Eventually, more businesses were added in the anticipation of a railroad coming through town. However, at the last second, the railroad relocated where they were going to lay the tracks, and they went through Polk instead. This sort of sealed Arborville's doom, which sounds ominous, but it was what happened. So Polk was established around 1906, and that's when the railroad basically changed its plans to lay the track through there. So there were a lot of people who built their entire lives, built their house, started a business around Arborville, but they realized that slowly it would fade out because you need to go where the money is, and that's where the railroad was at the time. So a lot of people jumped ship during this time and actually moved to Polk instead, because the town was eventually abandoned. It makes it sound like it was a mass exodus, but really, in truth, I think it happened a lot slower than that. I think there were a lot of people that did move away right away when they knew the railroad tracks were going to be laid in Polk, but I think a lot of people actually lasted a lot longer than that. And this is because, there's continued history of the town. So the town's history talks about this disastrous hailstorm in 1917, and then families being split apart and then reunited through the World War. There was a rather large cyclone that went through in the early 20s. They talk about the bank failures and the drought and the heat, and then in the 30s when people were hosting rodeos to boost morale. In 1942, 450 trees were planted on the church grounds. But their hard work could only last so long, and eventually, specifically February 15th, 1943, the post office closed, and then that same year the general store closed, and then in the 50s the school districts started busing schools to different areas, so the kids were being relocated, and then by the 1960s only 318 residents remained, and that's according to the 1960 census. So also in the 60s, there was a merger between churches, and the church there in town became United Church of Christ. And to this day, the only thing that stands and remains there in Arborville is that church and a cemetery. And that's it. That's it for Arborville. There is nothing left. Some interesting notes that I came across during my research. So there's this guy named Roy Milch. He won first prize with his tub of butter at the Chicago World's Fair, and it was made from cream from Arborville farmers, which I thought was interesting. There's an Earl Cooper, who I talked about in a previous Mondays at the Museum video. He went on to win several national championships in automobile racing, and he competed at the Indy 500 several times. If you haven't watched that episode yet, do, because it's really entertaining. And interestingly enough, the town, as hip and happening as it was never officially incorporated, which I thought was really interesting. So now I'm going to show you the artifacts that we have representing the Arborville section. We'll take a walking tour. So here is the full Arborville section. Here's a collection of mail from all over York County, but you can see Arborville is included there. And also included are things like McCool Junction, you've got York, you've got Thayer, Gresham, etc., etc. Here's a really interesting article from the York Daily News Times, and this is from 1968, and it talks about the Arborville Exodus, is what they're calling it, after that railroad track was laid through Polk. Here's a collection of items linked to Lemuel Rex Wilcox. Like I said, there was a lot of stories about people going to serve in World War I, including Lemuel. Super sad story. He did have a bomb explode on top of his helmet, and it broke both of his arms. And he actually laid on the battlefield until the ambulance could come get him. This happened in the morning, and he laid there till the afternoon, and he passed away in the ambulance on the way back. It's said that his sister was also serving in the World War as a nurse, and she went cemetery by cemetery until she found his body and then brought him back to be buried in Arborville. So really sad story. But what's interesting is, completely unrelated, I found this newspaper article that features pictures of gravestones from the cemetery there, and included is one of Lemuel Wilcox, which I thought was really neat. But here's some other military grave markers that are there at the cemetery that still stands. Here is the Arborville Township Journal from 1923 to 1943. Basically, if you owed the town money, you got written up for what you owed. Here's a picture of the cemetery. It is located off County Road D, and here are a collection of photos of Earl Cooper. He's the one I was talking about earlier with the racing career. So he went on to win national championships with the American Automobile Association in 1913, 1915, and 1917, which is really cool. And we have a couple of items in relation to the church that still stands there today. So they had their 125th anniversary in 2001. This Bible is from 1865, and it belonged to C.S. Harrison, who was the first pastor there. And we also have here, First Congregational Church there. And then also recently added on the wall here are more photos. So we have pictures of the general store and then a cabin that was there in town as well. So that is a very brief history of Arborville and the artifacts that we have representing it. So if you have any memories of the town, maybe you grew up there, or you had family there, or you live nearby, I would love to hear any memories that you would be willing to share. This is going to be up on our Facebook, our Instagram, our YouTube. Comment where you see it. We would love to hear your memories of Arborville. And next week we're going to be talking about Benedict. So make sure to tune in. We'll see you then.